ADCs.
Yeah,
So
that's
antibody
the big
drug
one.
conjugates, usually because what an ADC is mostly an antibody, and then it's got a linker attached to some, in this case, payload or some kind of business end of the molecule. So like targeted chemotherapy, right? So it goes to a target. Instead of killing all cells, it'll kill specific cells. So it's better for you. But the complication of that molecule requires multiple analyses because you need to know the whole thing's there. You need to know the thing with the pieces there. You might need to know if the piece fell off, because if the piece falls off, now it's like chemo, right? Now you're giving a toxin to every part of your body. It's no longer targeted. So that's where sometimes you might do a couple assays by LBA and a couple assays by mass spec and combine them, and then ADA is usually done by LBA.
It's like
Yeah.
you really need a couple PK methods for an ADC. It's like the total antibody, or sometimes it's referred to as the framework, or naked
the
antibody.
Conjugate.
Has all sorts of names to it. And then, as Don alluded to, the payload, the small molecule piece. But then there's the total ADC, right?
Yeah.
And that's one that gets a little bit trickier on the LBA side, because oftentimes they try to detect the payload, right? There's anti-payload antibodies.
And sometimes there's not anti-payload antibodies.
But they've come a long way, right? There are commercially available anti-payload antibodies that are actually very good, but they're incredibly expensive, right?
Yeah.
And that's part of the challenge there. So, or, and then there is the ADA piece of it, which usually has it's not just a simple anti-drug antibody assay, because now you've got different pieces of it: the linker, the payload, the linker, and maybe it degrades. Who knows what happens with but then the antibody framework itself. So the minimum 4 methods is needed.
Yeah.
The free and total payload is always going to be LCMS based. The total antibody, you got some options there, but typically it's ligand binding assay based.
Yeah.
And then if you asked us, I'm always going to push the total ADC kind of more towards the hybrid mass spec. Just, it depends on the building block.
Yeah.
If you have the right building blocks, then ligand binding assays make sense, but it's usually a little bit easier for you.
And more recently, we have several examples where we can get total antibody and ADC in one assay.
Yeah.
So if the ADC is going by mass spec and you were going to do LBA for total, but you can do one assay to get both, that just saves clients time and money and makes more sense.
That does make sense. If you and there's some of the wild west of ADCs, right? There's a lot of people won't do the total ADC, right? They just use the free and total payload, the total antibody, and they kind of stop.
Well, it also depends, I think, on the type of ADC, right? Now we have all types of almost Frankenstein kind of molecules, right? Where you don't have a payload anymore, you have an oligo attached.
Yeah.
An ARC, right? Or you have an RNA piece, an antisense, you have a peptide attached.
Click chemistry to release
Absolutely.
it. There's versions,
all kinds of
microenvironment,
more complicated things. And again, there's not one answer for that. I think it's each molecule needs to be looked at and understand what's the best approach and what reagents do you have that helps drive that approach.
Yeah, and there's even there is some utility going from one species to the next that makes sense. If sometimes the hybrid mass spec might be the preference there, as Don alluded to. If you can flex it and do a total ADC and your total antibody all on one shot on gold, and do it.
Well, and now you even have release, like you said, click things, or you have cleavage things, so you can cleave off the payload, and then the released payload is a representation of the ADC, but it's the same as a free payload, so then that's the same assay. So there's.
Is it a PK assay? No.
It is a PK assay.
We have probably 8 to 10 active ADCs. So that really is one of the major modalities that hybrid has power for. And then I think biomarkers, right? That becomes really, if you're trying to discern a protein or even a tweener, right? An in-betweener, where you get some promiscuity of the capture antibody, or maybe the detection isn't that great on the ligand binding assay side.
Or drug tolerance.
Yeah, that becomes an issue that you can help. Is a little bit easier to remedy on your side of things, because you're kind of pulling it out. But those are, and then and then what about AAVs or LNPs? There's a modality too that's got some potential power, although I think you can do those by standard mass spec too.